Hi, I'm Marc, and on this channel I talk about UK politics and Brexit from an outside view, although I do know the UK from the inside as well. And this week my channel is all about Brexit future discussions. And even if many people just don't want to hear the B word anymore, it still has an impact on the political landscape in Great Britain, but especially on the people in the country. And one of the ongoing discussions revolves around the nature of the British future relationship with the EU. Of course, the trade and cooperation agreement already exists, but other models are still being discussed in public today. And today I would like to talk about one of these models. And today it's about Switzerland. The trade relations between Switzerland and the European Union, the EU, are contractually regulated by a series of bilateral agreements, as Switzerland is not a member of the EU and is not part of the European Economic Area, the EEA. Instead, Switzerland has negotiated a large number of specific agreements with the EU over the years to regulate access to the internal market and also the economic cooperation. And there are some key agreements and regulations over time. First, we have the Free Trade Agreement of 1972. One of the most fundamental agreements is this Free Trade Agreement. It regulates duty-free trade of industrial products between Switzerland and the EU. And then we had a number of bilateral agreements. That's the first part in 1999. These agreements came into force in 2002 and include 7 different treaties. They cover a wide range of areas, and I want to name them for you. It's the free movement of persons. It allows Swiss and EU citizens free access to labor markets and residence. And then there was one about the technical barriers to trade, which is a harmonization of rules to facilitate trade. Then there was one on public procurement, opening of public contracts to suppliers from both regions. Then there was a deal on agriculture to facilitate trade in agricultural products. Then there was one on air transport with the integration of Swiss air traffic into European airspace. And then there was one on land transport with the regulation of transport through the Alps and compliance with environmental requirements. And then there was one on research with Switzerland's participation in European research programs. And then we got the second set of bilateral agreements in 2004, and these include 9 agreements, and they came into force in 2005. And they deepen cooperation in other areas. First of all, there was Schengen or Dublin. Switzerland participation in the Schengen area with the open borders and the Dublin system of the asylum procedures came into force there. Then there was one on interest taxation with the regulations for the taxation of interest income. And then there was one on combating fraud with the cooperation in combating fraud and illegal activities. And there were other agreements that cover topics such as the environment, education, and statistics. Over the years, there have been repeated negotiations on institutional issues, in particular regarding the dynamic adaptation of the agreements to new EU regulations and the dispute settlement. However, an institutional framework agreement negotiated in 2018 to regulate these issues was rejected by Switzerland in 2021, which led to some uncertainty about the future development of relations. And the trade relations between Switzerland and the EU are strongly contractually secured by the bilateral agreements mentioned. And these allow Switzerland comprehensive access to the EU internal market, but without formal memberships of the EU or the EEA. And the cooperation is based on mutual recognition of standards and, yes, continuous negotiation of new regulations. The bilateral agreements between Switzerland and the European Union have, of course, both advantages and, yes, disadvantages. And these arise from Switzerland's unique position, which has comprehensive access to the EU internal market without being a member of the EU. And first, I want to talk about the advantages of the bilateral agreements. The bilateral agreements give Switzerland extensive access to the EU internal market, particularly for industrial products and services. And this enables Swiss companies to export to and to invest in the EU without major trade barriers. And Switzerland retains its political independence and decision-making autonomy in many areas, as it is not forced to automatically adopt EU law, as would be the case with membership. And Switzerland can cooperate with the EU in certain areas while going its own way in others, and this enables it to better protect specific national interests. The agreement on the free movement of persons allows Swiss citizens to work and live in the EU and vice versa. And this promotes the exchange of workers and know-how and contributes to economic dynamism. And the bilateral agreements make it possible to find tailor-made solutions that are better suited to Switzerland's needs than their standardized EU regulations, but are quite headache producers. And of course, there are disadvantages, as I said, of the agreements. And as the agreements are static and are not automatically adapted to new EU laws, legal uncertainty arises. Switzerland must regularly conduct new negotiations to respond to changes in EU law, which is time-consuming and resource-consuming. And Switzerland, of course, has no direct influence on EU legislation, but in many cases it must adopt it indirectly in order to maintain market access. And this leads to a situation where, as they say, Switzerland follows rules without having a say. And in the event of disagreements or if negotiations fail, as in the case of the 2021 Institutional Framework Agreement, there is a risk that relations will cool and Switzerland will become more isolated, which could lead to economic disadvantages in the long term. And the static agreements can lead to different interpretations and problems in implementation, especially if new developments or technologies emerge that were not taken into account when the agreements were concluded. The bilateral agreements do not cover all areas of the EU internal market, which may lead to competitive disadvantages for some industries and for some sectors, for example in the financial sector, as market access in these areas is restricted. The bilateral agreements offer Switzerland the benefits of market access and economic integration with the EU in certain areas without the obligations and restrictions of membership. On the other hand, they bring challenges such as legal uncertainty, limited say, and potential political tensions, as we recently saw. And balancing these advantages and disadvantages requires constant adjustments and negotiations to safeguard Switzerland's long-term interests. The United Kingdom has sought to define new relations with the EU following its exit from the European Union with Brexit, and a Swiss model was discussed there too. A bilateral model similar to Switzerland's would very theoretically be possible, but it would face significant challenges and is politically complicated and, from my point of view, quite impossible. But are there opportunities and prerequisites for bilateral relations? Well, the UK could very theoretically negotiate bilateral agreements with the EU similar to those Switzerland has. However, this would require long and complex negotiations again. And the EU would need to be willing to enter into such agreements, which depends on whether the EU sees it as beneficial to make similar concessions. Need to be willing to adopt large parts of EU law, especially in the areas where it wants access to the single market. And this adoption without a say would face political resistance in the UK. And a central part of Swiss-EU relation is the free movement of people, which allows citizens to move and work freely in the other's area. However, the UK made it clear in the Brexit referendum that it wants to regain control over immigration. Accepting the free movement of people could therefore be quite a difficult condition for the UK. And the Swiss model requires constant adjustment and renegotiation, as I said, as bilateral agreements are not automatically adapted to new EU law. And this would be a source of uncertainty for the UK, as it would have to negotiate regularly to maintain market access. And a major obstacle in Swiss EU relations is the institutional issues, in particular how to settle disputes and how to align Swiss law with EU law. And similar problems would arise for the UK if it seeks bilateral agreements with the EU. And of course, there are certainly political and economic hurdles. The EU does have little interest in granting a neighboring country as large as important as the UK special conditions similar to those of Switzerland, so as not to encourage other countries to pursue a similar strategy. And as I said, they are even fed up with Switzerland here. And in addition, the EU may want to prevent the UK from enjoying advantages after Brexit without corresponding obligations. And there are strong political forces in the UK that prefer complete independence from the EU after Brexit. And they could resist a model like Switzerland's, as it could mean adapting EU rules without a say. The UK would have to weigh up whether it would benefit economically from a bilateral model that offers access to the internal market for some sectors, but may require compromises in terms of sovereignty and control. So a bilateral model based on the Swiss model would merely theoretically be possible for the UK, but they would have to be willing to adopt significant parts of EU law. They would have to accept the free movement of people and regularly conduct new negotiations. And these conditions would be difficult to enforce both domestically and in negotiations with the EU. And it is out of the question if the EU would grant another country, the conditions similar to those granted to Switzerland, because they were negotiating with Switzerland to get rid of those bilateral agreements, to get one comprehensive agreement. And this vast amount, we're talking about hundreds of deals here just for one relationship, they want to get rid of that. And they will never grant that to somebody else. But it was discussed. I talked about this when Sunak brought this up. So this week, when I'm going through all the different models, I had to include that again. But I wanted to make one thing very clear. There is no chance, except very hypothetically, there is no chance that Britain will get that relationship. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.